Chapter 8. The Hidden Path. Reid's breath misted heavily in the cold, crisp mountain air as he carefully guided his horse along the narrow ledge. The animal's hooves slipped occasionally on loose stones, and each stumble sent small rocks clattering down into the dark ravine below, a stark reminder of the perilous path they traveled. Yet he pressed forward, eyes constantly shifting between the uncertain footing and the battered figure guiding their small, weary group forward. Valen rode slightly ahead, his form stooped and exhausted, yet he moved with an air of quiet, unshakable determination that belied his obvious injuries. Reid had found himself watching the older man closely over the past several days of their flight, observing with a soldier's trained eye the way Valen navigated the terrain. There was a confidence in the artificer's movements, a quiet certainty that went beyond mere knowledge. He knew these mountains intimately, as one might know an old friend. The artificer would often pause briefly, glancing sharply around at landmarks only he recognized. A twisted tree, a faded rune carved into the stone, or a barely perceptible trail through dense brush. Each decision Valen made proved correct, leading them unerringly along paths that seemed impossibly obscure or dangerous, yet always guided them safely onward, just ahead of their relentless imperial pursuers. Reid felt admiration stirred deeply within him for Valen's quiet, stubborn resilience. The old man's wounds were severe, injuries inflicted by imperial torture clearly etched upon his pale, bruised flesh. Yet despite the toll taken on his body, Valen never once complained or faltered. Each step, each turn, each decision he made was driven by a steady, unbreakable determination, his commitment to their survival absolute. In Valen's quiet resilience, Reid saw a strength far different from his own, one forged not in the crucible of battle, but from something deeper and perhaps even more powerful. Aldrich rode silently beside Reid, his eyes focused carefully on the path ahead, his expression tense and wary. The knight's broad shoulders were tense, burdened by the responsibility he carried for the surviving knights riding behind them. Despite the quiet grief Aldrich bore for those they had lost, his trust in Valen grew visibly with every mile they traveled. The knight had initially shown caution towards Valen, the caution natural toward any stranger, but had quickly recognized the older man's unmatched knowledge and quiet courage. Aldrich's silent nods and approving glances became frequent, quiet acknowledgments of respect that Valen accepted wordlessly, responding only with a faint nod in return. Hours passed slowly, the mountain air growing colder, more biting as they ascended higher into the peaks. Reid pulled his cloak tighter around himself, feeling its scant warmth offer little against the chill. Occasionally, Valen would halt the group to let their exhausted mounts rest, checking the horses carefully, speaking softly to the weary beasts. During those quiet moments, Reid caught glimpses of deep sorrow hidden behind Valen's stoic facade, a sadness driven by memories he didn't share but clearly carried. During one of these pauses, Reid moved quietly beside Valen, offering him a water skin. Valen accepted it gratefully, drinking sparingly before returning it with a silent nod. Reid studied the older man thoughtfully for a moment, finally breaking the tense silence between them. "You know these mountains well," Reid remarked quietly, his voice gentle yet filled with genuine admiration. "Better than anyone else I've seen." Valen turned slowly, his dark eyes sharp despite their exhaustion. "Long ago these mountains were my home," he said softly, voice carrying a trace of wistfulness. "I've studied their paths and secrets for decades, learning them as one learns the lines upon their own hand." Reid nodded thoughtfully, sensing the weight of past memories haunting Valen's quiet words. "Your guidance has kept us alive. We owe you our lives." Valen offered a faint, tired smile, shaking his head slightly. "It's only knowledge, Captain. What truly matters is the purpose behind using it. I've waited many years for a chance to strike back against the Empire, to see my work save rather than destroy." Reid studied the older man carefully, feeling a sudden surge of understanding and empathy. Their situations, despite vast differences, were strikingly similar. Both had been cast unwillingly into this struggle, driven by events they couldn't control. They were men defined by war, their paths shaped by violence and loss, yet now joined by a shared purpose, a shared mission. Valen continued softly, voice strained yet determined. These trails, these forgotten passages, they were never truly forgotten. They waited, patiently hidden, for someone willing to find them again. The Empire believes itself unstoppable, but arrogance breeds blindness. Reid nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the wisdom behind the artificer's words. He felt newfound respect deepen, the sense of trust growing strong between them. In Valen, Reid found more than just a knowledgeable guide. He saw a fellow soul driven by the same determination, the same quiet resolve that fueled his own heart. Valen turned away abruptly, spurring his mount onward again. "We must press forward," he said softly but decisively. "We're close now. These paths will soon lead us to safety." As they rode onward, the narrow trails widened slightly, guiding them gently toward lower slopes, through dense stands of evergreen trees, whose branches whispered softly in the mountain breeze. Reid felt tension gradually ease, the prospect of safety finally tangible after days of relentless, perilous travel. Yet even as relief crept into his weary body, Reid knew their struggle was far from over. He understood clearly the depth of the threat facing them. Valen's revelations had only begun. The Empire's true strength remained hidden behind its walls, wrapped tightly in secrets, ancient technology that threatened destruction on a scale none of them fully comprehended. But for now, in this quiet moment beneath the gentle rustling of pine branches, Reid allowed himself to draw strength from the resilience of the man guiding them. Valen had already proven himself invaluable, not just as a guide, but as a source of quiet strength and wisdom. Whatever the coming days held, whatever trials awaited them next, Reid knew clearly they would face it together, strengthened by the quiet bond they had forged on this harsh journey. And though danger still loomed large behind them, ready to catch up at any moment, Reid rode forward resolutely, confident in the quiet determination of the man who had already guided them safely through countless dangers. The road ahead remained uncertain, yet now, thanks to Valen, it seemed somehow less daunting. They continued their cautious descent through the foothills, shadows of the mountains slowly receding as the late afternoon sun cast long, dappled patterns across their path. The silence around them gradually became more comforting than oppressive, broken only by the distant, lonely calls of mountain birds and the soft, rhythmic clopping of hooves against the rocky trail. Eventually, Valen halted briefly near the entrance to a dense copse of pines, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully at the terrain before them. He raised a hand, signaling a short rest, and carefully eased himself from his mount, moving stiffly as he settled onto a fallen log beside the trail. Reid quickly joined him, grateful for a brief reprieve as the surviving knights dismounted quietly, keeping vigilant eyes on their surroundings. Aldrich moved closer, taking up a protective position near Valen, watching the shadows warily. Reid could see clearly the weight the knight carried, the heavy responsibility he felt for every man still alive under his command. Aldrich said nothing, though his steady presence conveyed clearly his trust and loyalty, both to Valen and Reid. Valen took a slow, measured breath, his eyes closing briefly, betraying the toll this journey had exacted upon him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady, carrying clearly through the gentle rustling of trees overhead. "The Empire moves faster than we feared," he began quietly, staring at the ground as though seeing beyond it into distant realms of memory. "Their plans go beyond mere conquest. The power they seek, the ancient machines they intend to wield, are relics of a lost age, terrible weapons forgotten by all but the most learned historians." Reid frowned, feeling a sharp tension rise within him. "What sort of weapons are we talking about, Valen?" Valen lifted his gaze, meeting Reid's eyes directly, a quiet urgency sharpening his weary features. "They are called mechs, war machines of immense power, relics from a long-forgotten era, left buried and abandoned beneath the earth after ancient wars nearly destroyed our world. I spent years trying to understand them, hoping such knowledge might protect us. But now the Empire has twisted their purpose, corrupting them with paladin magic." Reid's jaw tightened, his heart sinking as he grasped the magnitude of Valen's revelation. He knew well enough what such weapons could mean, had seen their destructive potential firsthand, in a different life and a different world. The echoes of his past stirred sharply within him, familiar dread coiling tightly in his chest. "How many have they awakened?" Reid asked quietly, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at his core. "Enough," Valen replied softly, his tone grim and heavy with sorrow. "Even a handful could lay waste to entire kingdoms. With corrupted paladin magic controlling them, these relics become unstoppable, more dangerous than any army could hope to be. Aldrich stepped closer, eyes narrowing in troubled disbelief. "You're certain of this, Valen?" "Yes," Valen replied firmly, lifting his gaze slowly to meet Aldrich's questioning eyes. "They've recovered them, awakened them, and soon they will unleash them, starting with Veletria. They will make examples of any who stand against their conquest." Aldrich glanced anxiously at Reid, unspoken questions clear in the knight's worried expression. Reid hesitated, gathering his thoughts carefully, deeply aware of how much rested upon what he said next. "If these machines are as powerful as you say," Reid said carefully, his voice tight with controlled anxiety, "then we must reach Veletria swiftly. Althea needs to know to prepare." Valen nodded solemnly, but his gaze lingered thoughtfully upon Reid, studying him carefully, assessing more deeply the man who had risked so much to rescue him. Reid shifted slightly under the older man's scrutiny, sensing Valen saw more than just a foreign warrior before him. "You understand this threat better than you should," Valen murmured finally, his voice low and thoughtful, hinting at knowledge he hadn't yet openly acknowledged. "I sensed it from the moment we met. You've faced this kind of terror before, haven't you?" Reid hesitated, his jaw tightening with memories of a past he'd hoped to leave behind, a past filled with endless warfare and mechanical devastation. Finally, he answered quietly, truthfully, feeling the weight of that past pressing upon him once more. "Yes. In another place, another life, I have." Valen considered this quietly, understanding clear in his eyes. "Then perhaps it's no coincidence you're here now," he murmured thoughtfully. "You've faced these machines before. You know their power, their cruelty." Reid exhaled slowly, nodding silently. The thought filled him with unease, yet he knew Valen spoke truly. He had faced similar weapons of war before, and understood exactly how devastating their presence would be here. He had been sent to this world with a purpose he had not yet fully grasped. Perhaps this was it. He rose slowly to his feet, glancing down the mountain slope toward the faint shapes of trees and distant trails leading toward safety. And Veletria. "We must reach the castle immediately," he stated firmly. "Althea needs to know the truth before it's too late." Valen rose slowly beside him, nodding with quiet determination. "Then let us ride," he said, his voice calm and resolute, his injuries seemingly forgotten for now. "These ancient relics nearly destroyed our world once. We cannot allow history to repeat itself." As they remounted, Aldrich moved closer, gripping the reins tightly. "I only hope we're not already too late," the knight murmured grimly, his eyes distant and troubled. Reid met Aldrich's gaze firmly, feeling a surge of quiet determination pushing through his anxiety. "We will reach Veletria first. We'll warn Althea and find a way. We have to." Valen's guidance was their only hope, and as the old artificer resumed leading them down the mountain paths, Reid silently vowed that whatever sacrifices had been made, whatever hardships they'd faced, would not be wasted. His past had prepared him for this, and now, with Valen's invaluable knowledge and Aldrich's steadfast resolve beside him, he would see this through. Their journey had forged them into something more than merely allies. They had become brothers in purpose, bound by shared determination to withstand whatever the Empire brought against them. As their small group emerged from the shadow of the mountains, they could see rolling plains spread out below them in the distance, bathed in the fading golden light of the setting sun. But Reid felt no relief upon seeing the open ground ahead. He knew they could not afford to linger exposed. Imperial forces would soon pursue them again. Each passing minute brought their enemies closer, tightening the noose of pursuit, and Reid knew they could no longer evade them by stealth alone. "We can't outrun them forever," he muttered grimly, eyes scanning the landscape carefully. His gaze narrowed thoughtfully, settling upon a distant ridge cutting across the horizon, sharp and jagged, rising abruptly to form a narrow, winding canyon. A plan began to take shape immediately in his mind, coldly calculating the terrain's potential advantages. He turned sharply toward Aldrich, who was already scanning the area with the practiced eye of a seasoned soldier. "That canyon there, see how narrow it gets at its midpoint?" Aldrich nodded swiftly, immediately understanding Reid's tactical thinking. "A choke point, perfect for an ambush." "Exactly," Reid agreed firmly, already visualizing the defensive preparations clearly. "We'll lure them in, trap them in close quarters, and use the terrain against them." Valen rode closer, listening intently, his eyes narrowing as he followed Reid's gesture. "It's a sound strategy," the old artificer said thoughtfully. But dangerous. Our numbers are small. We'll need every advantage the terrain can give us. Reid nodded grimly, accepting the risk as inevitable. Then we'd best move quickly. Under the cover of the approaching night, their group hastened toward the ridge, working swiftly and silently to set their ambush. Aldrich took immediate command of the knights, demonstrating calm, disciplined efficiency as they moved quietly, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the urgency of their task. Pitfalls were dug swiftly and carefully concealed, covered with thin layers of branches and loose dirt. Sharp wooden stakes lined the hidden pits, deadly to any Imperial cavalry foolish enough to charge recklessly. Reid directed the men with calm precision, his voice low but clear, ensuring each trap was positioned exactly where needed. He meticulously checked each preparation personally, inspecting the placement of every pit and the tension of ropes rigged to trigger carefully arranged rockfalls from the canyon walls. With every trap they set, Reid reinforced his instructions, calmly emphasizing their precision. Every detail matters. A single oversight might cost us all. Aldrich moved silently among the knights, his presence a steadying force, ensuring every man performed his duty efficiently, quietly correcting or guiding them where needed. The knights responded instantly to his quiet commands, their trust and respect for him evident in their swift, disciplined movements. Despite dwindling resources, their resourcefulness shone through clearly. Every arrow was counted, every coil of rope measured carefully, every scrap of metal and wood put to precise use. Along the canyon's steep sides, a couple of knights were carefully positioned behind rocky outcroppings, their boughs concealed beneath cloaks and cloaked by sparse brush. Reid ensured each archer had clear sight lines, careful angles of fire chosen for maximum effectiveness against approaching Imperial troops. Aldrich reviewed each position, confirming lines of retreat and clear signals for engagement, ensuring everyone understood precisely when and how to spring their ambush. Reid paused briefly to survey their preparations, pride flickering briefly through the grim determination etched across his face. This was not the first time he had been forced into such desperate measures, and memories of similar ambushes from another life, another war, surged briefly through him. But he pushed them aside, focusing instead upon the present, knowing their success hinged entirely upon timing and precision. Valen watched Reid carefully, his gaze thoughtful and analytical. Finally, the old artificer approached him quietly, his voice barely audible above the rustling wind. "Your tactics are unlike any I've seen in this kingdom," Valen murmured, studying Reid with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Efficient, precise, almost clinical in their ruthlessness. Reid hesitated, meeting Valen's eyes steadily, weighing carefully how much to reveal. "Their tactics born from desperation and necessity," he admitted quietly, memories flickering briefly behind his eyes. "I've fought battles before where we had no advantage but our own cunning. Sometimes being outnumbered forces you to see things more clearly, to exploit every weakness your enemy gives you." Valen nodded slowly, thoughtful admiration deepening on his weary features. "Whatever battles you've faced before have served you well, Captain," he said softly. "Perhaps your perspective is exactly what we need. A fresh set of eyes unclouded by our world's assumptions. With the Empire's power growing unchecked, we must embrace every advantage we can find." Reid met Valen's gaze steadily, understanding the depth behind the artificer's words. "We'll need all our wits," he replied evenly, "and all the knowledge we can gather if we're to survive what's coming." Valen inclined his head, eyes brightening slightly despite his obvious fatigue. "Then I'm grateful fate placed you in our path, Reid. Perhaps together we might just surprise the Empire yet." Reid nodded slowly, the old man's words resonating deeply within him. It was a strange thought, yet comforting in its certainty. If fate had indeed brought him here, perhaps it was precisely to confront this very moment, to stand firm in defense of those who could not defend themselves. The preparations were nearly complete as the light began fading entirely from the sky, twilight cloaking the canyon in long, shifting shadows. Reid moved among the men one final time, silently inspecting each carefully laid trap, each concealed archer, every calculated detail designed to ensure their survival. Aldrich moved beside him quietly, their gazes meeting in quiet agreement. "We've done everything we can," the knight said firmly, voice filled with quiet determination. "Now we wait." Reid took a deep breath, feeling the tense anticipation tighten within him. They had laid their trap expertly, used every advantage they possessed, yet uncertainty lingered. The Empire was powerful, their troops disciplined, relentless, and their numbers overwhelming. Still, Reid knew they had given themselves a fighting chance. He turned toward the distant horizon, the darkness growing deeper, more oppressive as the last light faded. Soon their pursuers would appear, unaware of the deadly welcome awaiting them in this narrow canyon. He silently steeled himself, gathering his resolve, allowing quiet confidence to steady his nerves. "We'll make them pay dearly for every step they take," Reid murmured firmly, his voice low but resolute. "No matter what comes next, we stand firm. For those we lost, and for those counting on us." Aldrich nodded grimly, sword held ready, eyes scanning the shadows intently.
"Then let them come,"
he replied fiercely. "We are ready." In the darkness around them, the knights quietly shifted, tightening their grips on weapons, settling into position with quiet determination. Each man stood silently prepared, knowing their enemy approached swiftly, unaware and arrogant, confident that victory was already theirs. Yet Reid felt no fear, only a calm certainty as he stood motionless at the mouth of the narrow canyon. The night pressed closely around him, cold and silent, concealing the deadly intent of the preparations they'd meticulously arranged. Beside him, Aldrich stood in tense readiness, his sword held low but ready, eyes fixed unblinkingly toward the darkness ahead. They exchanged a brief, wordless glance, an acknowledgement of trust, of the grim necessity of what was about to unfold. The stillness shattered suddenly. Thunderous hoofbeats echoed sharply through the canyon walls, rapidly approaching and growing louder, a warning of the impending violence. Reid tightened his grip on his sword, feeling a familiar thrill of adrenaline surge through his veins. There would be no room for hesitation, no space for error. Everything depended on precise timing and ruthless efficiency. The Imperial cavalry appeared suddenly from the shadows, their armor gleaming faintly in the dim moonlight, faces hidden behind expressionless visors. They charged forward recklessly, confident in their overwhelming force, oblivious to the danger closing swiftly around them. Reid silently counted the riders as they thundered forward into the narrow confines of the canyon. 10, 15, perhaps more. Too many to face directly, yet exactly the number they had anticipated. With a swift, decisive nod from Reid, Aldrich raised his hand sharply, signaling the hidden archers along the cliff edges. Arrows hissed swiftly through the night air, a lethal volley striking precisely into the front ranks of the Imperial cavalry, toppling several soldiers from their horses in sudden bursts of confusion and pain. Panic erupted instantly, horses screaming and rearing, their riders shouting angrily as they tried to restore order amidst the sudden chaos. But Reid had prepared for precisely this reaction. He raised his hand next, signaling the knights hidden behind carefully piled boulders and concealed trenches. In perfect unison, ropes were cut and levers pulled, releasing rockfalls that thundered violently down the canyon walls. The sudden crashes echoed deafeningly, driving startled horses into wild panic and confusion, crushing soldiers beneath waves of heavy stone, burying them in thick dust and debris. The Imperial ranks dissolved swiftly into chaotic disarray. Soldiers shouted frantically. Horses stumbled and collided, unable to maneuver or retreat easily within the narrow confines. Yet Reid felt no satisfaction, only grim resolve, knowing their advantage would vanish quickly if they failed to seize it fully. He surged forward instantly, sword flashing in the moonlight, Aldrich close at his side, the surviving knights following quickly, attacking with ruthless precision. His movements were calculated, measured, not a trained swordsman but a survivor, relying on instinct, experience, and raw adaptability. Battle erupted savagely in the narrow confines of the canyon. Steel clashed violently against steel, shouts mingled harshly with screams of pain and terror. Reid fought fiercely, not with the practiced precision of Aldrich but with cold efficiency. His sword met an Imperial's blade, the impact jarring his arm, forcing him to deflect rather than counter. He stepped back, letting the momentum of his opponent's swing carry forward, then he drew his sidearm. A sharp crack shattered the knight as he fired. The Imperial soldier staggered back, a single bullet punched clean through his breastplate. The man crumpled, dead before he hit the ground. Reid's mind registered the spent round. 2 left. He had to make each count. Beside him, Aldrich fought with disciplined efficiency, his blade precise and lethal, striking without hesitation, his face a grim mask of determination beneath his helmet. Their knights surged around them, striking into the chaos, but the Imperials fought back with equal fury. Despite the devastation of the ambush, they rallied with frightening speed, training and discipline driving them forward. An Imperial soldier lunged at Reid, his longsword flashing in the dim light. Reid barely parried in time, feeling the jarring force of the strike run up his arm. The soldier pressed forward, heavy and relentless, their weapons locking, strength against strength. Reid knew he wouldn't win this contest. He twisted sharply, ducking low, forcing distance between them. Another gunshot echoed through the canyon. Reid's second bullet tore into the soldier's thigh, dropping him instantly. The man gasped, pain cutting through his battle cries, and before he could recover, a knight's blade found his throat. Reid exhaled sharply, his grip steadying on his sword. One shot left. The Imperials fought savagely, pushing back against the trap despite their losses. Each step forward they took was stained with blood. Each moment stretched into eternity as Reid, Aldrich, and their dwindling force struggled to hold the line. Reid saw one of their knights fall, impaled brutally by an Imperial lance. Another was struck down moments later, crushed beneath the powerful swing of an enemy's blade. He gritted his teeth, feeling the sharp sting of each loss, but he fought on. His sword clashed with another, steel ringing against steel, but his grip faltered against the sheer force of his opponent's strike. The Imperial knocked him off balance, raising his blade for the killing blow. Reid's body reacted before his mind did. His sidearm lifted, barrel aligning with the open slit of the Imperial's helmet. The last shot rang out. The soldier stiffened, eyes wide, then collapsed soundlessly. Reid stood over the body, chest heaving, knowing he had emptied the weapon. No more chances. The sidearm was nothing more than dead weight now. He holstered it, gripping his sword tighter, knowing from here on, steel was his only means of survival. Around him, the remaining knights fought desperately, the enemy's overwhelming numbers thinning yet still dangerous. Reid moved quickly, staying light on his feet, keeping his strikes defensive, trusting Aldrich and the others to do the heavy work. He worked alongside them, not through sheer strength, but through instinct, avoiding direct engagement where he could, using quick strikes to keep the enemy off balance. Finally, after what felt like hours, yet had only been minutes, the remaining Imperial soldiers began to break, their ranks fracturing, discipline crumbling completely. Those who could still flee retreated hastily, abandoning their fallen comrades as they fled back toward open ground, desperate to escape the deadly canyon trap. Aldrich lowered his sword, breathing heavily, his face streaked with blood and sweat. His eyes scanned quickly over the battlefield, noting the fallen knights and wounded survivors. He met Reid's gaze silently, grief evident even beneath his stoic expression. Reid nodded slowly in understanding, acknowledging silently the heavy price they'd paid for victory. The ambush had succeeded, but at a devastating cost. Many brave men lay lifeless upon the rocky ground, each loss a heavy burden Reid now carried within his heart. "We have little time," Reid said quietly, voice thick with exhaustion yet unyielding in determination. "Gather our wounded quickly. We must move swiftly. More Imperials will come soon." Aldrich nodded solemnly, giving quick, sharp orders to the few remaining men. The wounded were quickly aided, while the fallen knights were given swift, silent honors, moments of quiet respect before the living moved swiftly to leave the scene behind. Reid stood silently beside Valen, who watched the aftermath of battle with sorrowful eyes. The artificer met Reid's gaze, his expression quiet but full of weary determination. "The cost of victory is always high," Valen murmured softly, his voice filled with quiet sympathy. "But sometimes there is no other way." Reid sighed heavily, eyes fixed grimly upon the blood-stained canyon, now silent once again beneath the pale moonlight. "It always feels too high," he replied softly, "but surrender isn't an option." Valen nodded solemnly, his gaze gentle yet resolute. "Then let their sacrifice mean something," he murmured quietly. "Use this chance they've given us." Reid straightened slowly, steeling his resolve once more. The night stretched dark and uncertain ahead, filled with unknown perils, yet he knew clearly the mission was far from complete. They had struck a powerful blow tonight, yet the Empire would not forgive this humiliation. Their enemies would return swiftly, more ruthless and relentless than ever. He turned back toward the distant road, leading the survivors forward swiftly, resolved to honor the fallen knights by ensuring their sacrifices were not wasted. Veletria's safety depended upon it, and Reid would see this fight through, no matter how fierce or terrible it became. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, bleeding soft gold and pink hues into the sky, but Reid barely noticed. The world around him was painted in exhaustion, the weight of their escape pressing down on his shoulders like iron chains. The blood-stained canyon was hours behind them, yet the scent of battle still clung to his senses, as if the echoes of the dead refused to release their grip. The mountain trails had given way to rolling plains, the path to Veletria now clear but perilously open. They rode hard, pushing their weary horses across the uneven terrain, each breath harsh and shallow from exhaustion. Aldrich rode silently beside him, his posture rigid, his hands gripping the reins so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The two remaining knights followed closely, their numbers pitifully small now, yet they pressed on without complaint. Valen, though pale and visibly drained, held firm in the saddle, his focus unshaken despite the toll the journey had taken on him. No one spoke for a long while, the only sounds their horses' labored breaths and the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the earth. But the silence was not the comforting kind. It was weighted, filled with unspoken grief, lingering on every man like an open wound. Finally, Aldrich broke it, his voice quiet but laced with barely contained frustration. "We lost too many," he muttered, not looking at Reid. "Good men. Cut down like nothing. And for what? A temporary reprieve?" Reid didn't answer immediately. He understood Aldrich's anger. He felt it too, though his was a quieter, more familiar kind of grief. He had seen too many battlefields, too many sacrifices that had felt meaningless in the moment. But he also knew the truth. Survival had a cost, and the only way to honor the dead was to ensure their sacrifices weren't wasted. "We bought ourselves time," Reid said finally, his voice level, yet edged with quiet steel. "If we hadn't fought there, the Imperials would have run us down. They would have slaughtered us, and then marched straight to Veletria unchallenged. What we did back there—" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "It wasn't just for us. It was for the city." Aldrich turned his head slightly, his eyes searching Reid's face for a moment before he scoffed bitterly. "And what if it wasn't enough? What if we just delayed the inevitable?" Reid tightened his grip on the reins. He didn't blame Aldrich for the doubt, for the anger. He was a knight, raised on the idea that battles were fought with honor, that warriors met their enemies in open combat. But the world wasn't that simple, and it never had been. "If it wasn't enough, then at least we tried," Reid said evenly. "At least we gave them a fighting chance." Aldrich let out a sharp breath, clearly unsatisfied but unable to argue the truth of Reid's words. He fell silent again, his gaze dark as he stared straight ahead. Valen, who had been listening quietly, shifted slightly in his saddle, wincing at the movement. "You two are arguing over inevitabilities," he murmured, voice hoarse yet steady. "What matters now is reaching Veletria before the Empire regroups. We've bloodied them, but that won't last. They will come back." Reid nodded grimly, knowing the old man was right. "Then we ride faster." The order didn't need to be repeated. The knights pushed their exhausted mounts onward, gritting their teeth against the ache in their limbs, against the sting of injuries hastily bandaged after the ambush. Time was against them, and the only thing they could do was move. The sun climbed higher as they rode, the land stretching wide and endless before them. The plains were deceptively quiet, the tall grass swaying gently in the wind, as if the world had not just been set ablaze with blood and war. But Reid knew better than to be lulled by the illusion of peace. They crested a low hill, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope flared in Reid's chest. There, on the distant horizon, stood the towering walls of Veletria. For a moment no one spoke, their horses slowing as each man took in the sight. The city stood strong, its silhouette framed against the sky, the banners still waving proudly from its towers. It was a sight that should have brought relief, yet Reid felt only a sharp pang of urgency. They were close, but they were not safe, not yet. He turned his gaze toward the distance behind them, scanning the plains for any sign of movement. The Empire would not stay beaten for long. If they were lucky, they still had time. If not, Reid shook the thought away. "Let's move. We're not there yet." With renewed purpose, they rode hard toward the city, ignoring the ache in their bones, the the burn of exhaustion in their muscles. As the walls grew closer, the tension in Reid's chest coiled tighter, a silent urgency pressing against his ribs. They had made it this far. Now, they just had to reach the gates before it was too late. Reid and the others rode hard toward the gates of Veletria, dust kicking up beneath their horses' hooves as the towering walls loomed ever closer. The city was awake, its defenders already gathering atop the ramparts, spotting their desperate approach. A horn blew from the watchtower, recognition, followed by the heavy groan of iron gates creaking open. The moment they passed through, exhaustion slammed into Reid like a hammer. He barely managed to dismount before his legs buckled, forcing him to brace against his horse. Aldrich slid off his mount with a weary grunt, turning immediately to help one of their wounded knights whose face was pale beneath his dented helmet. Valen dismounted last, his expression grim, his eyes already sweeping the city streets as though searching for someone. A familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Get them inside! Quickly!" Reid turned his head just as Althea strode toward them, her steps measured but sharp with urgency. Even through his exhaustion, he immediately noticed how different she looked. Her usual composed demeanor was still there, but her movements carried a new weight, something heavier, more deliberate. A bandage was wrapped tightly around her forearm, and faint bruises colored the side of her jaw. But it wasn't just the visible wounds that caught his attention. It was the way people moved around her now, the way the knights and soldiers watched her with renewed awe, not just as a leader, but as something more. "You made it," she said, slowing as she reached them, her sharp gaze sweeping over their battered forms. "But where are the others?" Aldrich answered before Reid could speak. "Gone. They fell buying us time." Something flickered in Althea's eyes, a shadow of grief that she quickly hid behind hardened resolve. She gave a short nod, accepting the loss in the way only leaders could, acknowledging it, shouldering it, and pressing forward regardless. Reid pushed himself upright, ignoring the deep ache in his limbs. "We need to talk. Now." Althea studied his face for a moment before turning on her heel. "Follow me." Inside the castle, Reid felt the weight of the stone walls around him, sturdy, unyielding, but suddenly insufficient against the storm that was coming. They moved quickly through the halls, past murmuring soldiers and castle attendants who whispered in hushed tones at the sight of them. It wasn't just them that the people were speaking about, he realized. It was her. Reid exchanged a glance with Aldrich, who seemed to notice it as well, but neither spoke until they reached the war room. The doors shut behind them, sealing them off from the outside noise. Althea took her seat, exhaling slightly as she settled into the high-backed chair. Reid noted the way she shifted, not quite wincing, but moving as though still feeling the aftershocks of something intense. Before he could ask, Valen spoke first. "The Empire is planning to unleash something worse than anything we've faced before," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. "They've recovered ancient war machines, mechs, built in an era long forgotten. But they aren't simply reviving them. They are binding them with paladin magic, corrupting them, turning them into something even more terrifying." The room went deathly silent. Reid saw the realization dawn across Althea's face, the swift shift from surprise to understanding, then to something darker, something deeply aware of the magnitude of this threat. "How certain are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more controlled. Valen met her gaze without hesitation. "I've seen the remnants of their work. I was held captive near one of their excavation sites. They are close, too close." Althea exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening against the arm of her chair. "If what you say is true, then the Empire doesn't just want to conquer Veletria." Her eyes lifted, locking onto Reid's. "They want to erase it." Reid nodded. "That's why we pushed so hard to get back here. We have to act now before they finish whatever they're building." Althea's expression remained unreadable for a moment, before she leaned back slightly. "Then it seems we are both bringing dire news." Reid frowned. "What do you mean?" A brief silence stretched between them before Althea finally spoke. "The Empire sent a paladin to our gates while you were gone. A man named Erendor." Reid's eyes narrowed. "A paladin came here? Alone?" "He wasn't alone. He brought an entire force and demanded our surrender," Althea replied, her voice sharp. "And when I refused, he destroyed part of our walls with a single strike of his blade. He was ready to tear down this city piece by piece." Aldrich tensed beside him, anger flickering across his features. "Then how are we still standing?" Althea met his gaze evenly. "Because I fought him. The weight of those words settled over the room like a sudden drop in temperature. Reid stared at her, the pieces falling into place. The whispers, the awe in her soldier's eyes, the way they looked at her now. "You fought a paladin," he said, more statement than question. Althea inclined her head slightly. "Yes." "And won." A faint, almost wry smile touched her lips. "Yes." Reid leaned forward slightly, studying her, trying to fully grasp what this meant. How? For the first time since he had met her, Althea hesitated, as if weighing whether to say the words aloud. But in the end, she did not look away. "Because I am one," she said simply. "A paladin." Silence followed, heavy, tense. Reid exhaled, leaning back in his chair, letting the words settle. In another life, this revelation might have shocked him. But here, in a world where paladins wielded magic and ancient war machines were awakening from their graves, it simply fit. He met her gaze again, this time with new understanding. "Then we have more than just mechs to worry about." Althea nodded. "Yes. The Empire knows what I am now, and they will come for me just as surely as they will come for this city." Reid ran a hand over his face, exhaustion briefly washing over him again before he pushed it aside. "Then we don't have time to waste." "No," Althea agreed. "We don't." The room fell into a charged silence as the weight of their collective knowledge settled between them. They had no illusions now. The Empire was coming, and when it did, it would bring not only legions of soldiers, but machines of war and vengeance for the humiliation Althea had delivered to one of their own. Reid ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply as his thoughts raced. There was too much to do, too many threats converging on them at once, and not nearly enough time to prepare for them all. But as his mind sifted through every grim revelation laid before them, a thought hit him like a punch to the chest. "Cassius!" he muttered suddenly, eyes snapping to Althea. Did he make it back? Soren too? Althea blinked, surprised by the sudden change in focus, but she nodded. "Yes. They returned 3 days before you did. It was close, from what I was told. The Imperials nearly caught them outside the city, but the knights who rode with them, they gave their lives to make sure Cassius got through." Reid felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar weight settling over him. Another sacrifice. More lives given in the name of survival. "He's working on Valen's research as we speak," Althea continued, her tone shifting slightly. "And he hasn't slept since." At that, Valen stirred from his deep contemplation, his gaze sharpening. "He's alive? And he has the research?" Althea nodded. "He refuses to rest. He's been locked in his workshop since he arrived, with Soren at his side. I've sent food, sent people to check on him, but he won't stop." Valen pushed himself up from his seat, wincing slightly at the movement. "Then I need to go to him. Now." Althea hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Go. If Cassius has been trying to unravel your work, then show him what he needs to see." Valen wasted no time, striding for the door with urgency despite his exhaustion. As the doors swung shut behind him, Reid exhaled and leaned forward, bracing his forearms against the edge of the table. "Then that's our best shot," he said firmly. "Cassius and Valen might be able to find something, anything, that gives us a fighting chance against what's coming." Althea nodded, though her expression remained grim. "We can't put all our hopes in one solution. We need to prepare Veletria for the worst." Reid met her gaze. "Agreed." The war room fell into motion. Althea issued sharp, precise orders to the gathered knights and commanders, outlining exactly what needed to be done. The walls had to be reinforced, defensive positions reassessed, supplies rationed and stored for a prolonged siege. Scouts had to be sent out to monitor the Empire's movements. If they had time before the next attack, it was now, before the enemy arrived in full force. Reid added his own insights, his mind falling into old tactical habits. If the Empire was bringing war machines, then their best hope was to control the battlefield before the machines could be fully unleashed. That meant choke points, high ground, sabotage, any tactic that could slow the enemy, force them to fight on their terms rather than the Empire's. But as plans were set into motion, Althea fell silent for a moment, watching the flurry of activity around her. Reid noticed the shift in her posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way she clenched her hands into fists before relaxing them. "You all right?" he asked. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I was raised to be a ruler, Reid. Not a warrior. I was trained to govern, to navigate politics, to lead from within these walls. But now, She exhaled, shaking her head slightly. Now I must be something else entirely. And there is no turning back. Reid studied her for a long moment before nodding. You don't get to choose the war you fight, he said, his voice quieter now. Only how you fight it. Althea met his gaze, and for a brief moment, the weight of command, of the impossible burden she carried, was laid bare between them. Then she straightened. The moment passed and she was once again the ruler of Veletria, unshaken. We'll hold, she said, more to herself than to him. We have to. Reid nodded. Then we make damn sure the Empire regrets coming here. They stood together in the war room, listening to the distant sounds of preparations being made, the ringing of metal as weapons were sharpened, the heavy footsteps of soldiers moving into position. Outside, Veletria was coming alive, preparing for war. For the first time since returning, Reid allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Not because of walls or weapons, but because of the people standing beside him,